After years of the U.S. pivoting to Asia, there's now a bipartisan consensus that China is one of, if not the major threat to U.S. stability and prosperity. But concentrated action that matches the gravity of this threat is still missing. As the lead official for the 2018 National Defense Strategy, Elbridge Colby grappled with how to redirect attention and resources against China. His new book, The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict, offers one solution. All three of our panelists have published widely on this topic. I'm going to introduce them briefly right now. Bridge is a co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative. From 2018 to 19, he was director of the defense program at the Center for New American Security. Before that, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development at the Pentagon. Dan Blumenthal is Senior Fellow and Director of Asian Studies here at AEI. I think it's fair to say he's been warning people about the China challenge since before it was cool. And he is the author most recently of The China Nightmare from AEI Press, published 2020. Oriana Skylar Mastro is Non-Resident Senior Fellow at AEI, Center Fellow at the Freeman Institute for International Studies at Stanford, serves in the U.S. Air Force as Strategic Planner at Indo-Pacific Command. Her latest book is The Costs of Conversion, Obstacles to Peace Talks in Wartime, 2019. So I'm going to ask Bridge to open with a brief summary of his book. I will just begin by saying there aren't a lot of university press books that have this kind of impact on Washington policy discussion. I think in this case it's well-deserved. So congratulations, Bridge, and the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thanks very much to Colin and Dan and Oriana for joining. It's such a pleasure to be with three friends and honor each of them a major policy, thought leader and scholar in his or her own right. And of course, thanks to AEI and the assembled here. I'll be brief because I think there's a tremendous amount of knowledge among the other panelists, and I think a discussion would be great. But I think actually the Ukraine situation really highlights very well the reason I wrote this book, which was the fundamental reality of scarcity, scarcity in the most basic sense in terms of power in the international system. And the fact that our legacy strategies, particularly defense strategies, but actually extending to all fields of government endeavor, were sort of on autopilot, that we were the sort of the unipole or the hegemon or what have you. And the Ukraine situation shows how deeply rooted that is across the political spectrum, that people are still acting as if we can, go big in Europe and at the same time take on China and the Middle East and so forth. And I think, my experience in the Pentagon, Oriana's grappled with this very intimately as well, is that that's just wrong. As people point out, we are losing the war games over Taiwan going forward. We're also not doing great in Europe. And of course, outcomes haven't been fantastic in the Middle East. So in this condition of scarcity, we need to think more strategically. I mean, to be a little bit cliched, but I think strategically about how we, rack and stack, how we orient, how we allocate our resources and our efforts in the world. And that's what this book is designed to be. It's a strategy in the sense of a framework, a way of making decisions and optimizing in conditions of scarcity and uncertainty. And in that context, I kind of proceed deductively in the book, in the sense that, all right, well, what's our most important interests? Well, our core interests are the security, prosperity, and liberty of the American people. Enlightened self-interest, to be sure, but our self-interest nonetheless. And in that context, the biggest threat posed to us is the agglomeration of power by some entity in the international system that could impose its will on us. If you don't have enough power, there's not that much you can do. Cuba doesn't like us, but there's not that much they can do to us. And in that context, by far the most dangerous threat is a state, China, that is 20 to 25% of global GDP and growing, establishing a dominant or hegemonic position in Asia, which is going to be upwards of 50% of global GDP. So China is the biggest other state in the international system, and Asia is its most important region. And it seems pretty clear that that is, in fact, what China is pursuing. So if we get Asia right, as Churchill put it, if you get things right in the decisive theater, you can put everything else right afterwards, but not the reverse. And so that's the logic of this book. And the way to do that, the strategy of denial in the geopolitical context, is an anti-hegemonic strategy, and it's predicated on an anti-hegemonic coalition. States that share our opposition, there are deeply rooted interest in averting Chinese hegemony over Asia, naturally mostly Asian states, Japan, India, Australia, Taiwan itself, Vietnam to some extent, et cetera, a few others. that needs to come together and check China's desire for regional hegemony. If we check them in Asia, we'll be able to handle the other theaters to a satisfactory degree. Critical to that, and this is, I think, an important point that the current administration underestimates, is the military context. In fact, is the most important thing, I would say, in the near term, because while China does have enormous economic influence, it's having difficulty, as we found, translating that economic power into decisive political outcomes. You can see that in places like India, actually Australia right now, et cetera. So they can sit and wait, or they can use their enormously capable military forces, and Oriana's written very eloquently and knowledgeably about this, that are designed not merely for self-defense anymore, but for power projection, the ability to project power and impose their will on others. And in that context, I think that is very worrisome, including in this decade, and Dan and others have been warning about that, as well as Oriana. So that has got to be the focus for our military planning, and that is a critical military goal. If we get the military piece right, then it will become less relevant, but if we ignore it, it will become a dominant problem. And in that context, we need a defense and a military strategy, really, that's keyed to our interests. And this is a very important point, particularly when we're thinking about our defense planning, is we can't have a strategy that's kind of crazy or feckless to implement, like one that relies on, defending our partners in this anti-hegemonic coalition by, dramatic escalation in nuclear war or collapsing our economy or something. Rather, we need a rational strategy that's proportional to our interests, and this is something I emphasize throughout the book. And in that context, how do we think about it? Well, first of all, we need to go after we need to prepare for China's best strategy, and this is something we can get into if of interest. But we shouldn't prepare for what it's putatively most likely or most dangerous or so. It's got to be its most net gainful. That's what we need to most prepare for, because that's what is most, in a sense, most dangerous, actually, to use the term properly. And we need a strategy that's proportioned to our interests at stake. And in that context, what we should be preparing for, and this is the latter part of denial, is a military strategy of denial, which is that our goal is to preserve the functioning of this anti-hegemonic coalition, to keep it going in the face of China's best strategy. And what does this require? It requires a defense of vulnerable allies and partners, particularly allies within this anti-hegemonic coalition, that are subjected to China's, what I call its focused and sequential strategy. Basically turning the spotlight onto vulnerable parts of our coalition, zapping them, and then trying to eventually cause a run on the bank by undermining U.S. credibility, which is central to the functioning of this coalition. I think of it as a kind of a differentiated form of credibility. And if we can do this, the coalition, this strategy of denial, the coalition should hold up. And the test case for this is Taiwan, because Taiwan is the forward line. There's obviously debate about whether Taiwan should be in our perimeter. My view is that net, we're already committed, and it's very militarily significant. There are other reasons, others like Dan point to, the ideological element. I look at the geopolitical element, more the strategic element, although he does too. But if we can do it for Taiwan, then we can also defend, by definition, the Philippines, Australia, Japan, and largely speaking, South Korea, and our coalition should come together. So that's the goal. The implications for this are profound. The political or strategic goal here is actually relatively low. It's a denial defense. But given how powerful China is, it's immensely demanding from a military and procurement and resources point of view. And in that context, I believe we're going to need, in fact, increasingly, and I think the Biden administration's handling of the Ukraine crisis is probably only going to exacerbate this, we're going to have to really draw down, if not cut, commitments in other theaters, including the Middle East and Europe. And in Europe, I would say generally reducing significantly in order to substantiate this commitment. Asia's the decisive theater. We got to get it right. And so every dollar needs to go towards making sure that we can meet that standard in a Taiwan scenario before we allocate it for anything else. This is a particularly important issue for the upcoming national defense strategy. We need to make sure we can fight that big war and win the big war first before we get distracted by something else. The only other things we should really be focusing on concurrently is a nuclear deterrent that makes sure we've always got a response, including both against Russia and China, and low-cost counterterrorism. Otherwise, we should offload it onto our allies and get them to do more, or take risk. That's the nature of things in a scarce environment. So that's the argument of the book. And again, as I said, I think the Ukraine situation is throwing it into high relief. But look forward to the comments and the discussion. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Bridge. Dan, let's hear your response. Dan, can you unmute?
Absolutely. I didn't want anyone to hear those first few comments. So congratulations on the book. I did a review in the Wall Street Journal that was very favorable and encouraged about starting a real debate about how to best defend Taiwan, including taking on issues of, as Bridge did, of escalation and a view on whether things will escalate and whether things can be kept limited. Obviously, Bridge thinks they can, and so forth. Let me make a few comments. One is I'm taking a different lesson from Ukraine, and that is that the following: that we actually don't, I've been pushing for a defense commitment and a political commitment to Taiwan since I was in government in 2002 to 2004, but we don't have one, right? We don't have one, and there is no coalition in Asia. There's a coalition we're trying to create, and we're trying to create it in the vision of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, the free and open Indo-Pacific order. There are pieces of it. There's a quadrilateral of democracies but they don't do anything militarily. And there is, as we speak, no coalition. Nobody's committed to defend Taiwan. So I take the Ukraine case very pessimistically, which is China can quite easily avail itself of the opportunity to begin a crisis across the strait that really threatens war, and get the United States into a negotiation of some kind, and press the United States to find a way to get Taiwan to accept its political demands, and Taiwan wouldn't have a choice. I would put out here that Taiwan is sui generis. Nobody recognizes Taiwan either, so Taiwan is particularly and uniquely susceptible to coercion and subversion. It's not at all like, let's say, the UK under the conditions of the Battle of Britain. UK was a country recognized by others with a long tradition. And again, nobody's committed. Nobody's actually committed to its defense. Now, I would not take any issue on how important it is to defend Taiwan for all kinds of reasons. But the other point I would make is that the Chinese Communist Party does not really see Taiwan in geopolitical terms. Now, that's not to say that there aren't people in the PLA, high up in the PLA. And Toshi Yoshihara, a few years ago of CSBA, did some great work in looking at PLA strategists to write about things like the First Island Chain and so on. But in a recently deep study we've done, it's not completed, the CCP talks of Taiwan as a problem. It's escalating its rhetoric that Taiwan is a problem of separatists, meaning the Democratic political party, the Democratic Progressive Party, working with external forces, meaning the United States, in order to permanently split China. And it's put forth its political demands already for how we can solve this crisis, and it obviously means under its terms. And the CCP has an armed wing. It's not a national military, it's the People's Liberation Army. And that armed wing will be called upon to use military intimidation and pressure and possibly invasion if China's demands are not met. But China's hoped for strategy, what it would like to do is engineer the same kind of change that it made on Hong Kong. We should look at that case very seriously. Very similar rhetoric ratcheted up on Hong Kong right before the CCP went ahead and passed the national security law, which was done in a very cautious and incremental way. But if we look back and reverse engineer, we see that they were warning us they were going to do it for quite a while. They would like to do the same thing, which is use the anti-secession law of 2005, say it's been violated, and say that until such time as someone can actually implement it and come back into compliance with it, military pressure will continue up to and including an invasion. The difference, obviously, is China has the problem that it's separated from Taiwan by water. It doesn't have yet a Carrie Lam, but it can change a Carrie Lam in Taiwan. But it could change all those conditions. So what it could change all those conditions through military coercion, intimidation, and the threat of an invasion. And it's absolutely true that the people of Taiwan, which I've been writing about for a very long time, ever since they elected Tsai Ing-wen in 2016, have rejected the political demands of China. But it's all up to us. So if we in a crisis don't want to go to war, and by the way, let me just sort of say that if I'm Xi Jinping, there is nothing in my calculations that would show me that the United States is ready to defend Taiwan. So I have, if I'm Xi Jinping, I have destroyed Tibetan culture, one separatist part of China. I've destroyed Xinjiang with no cost. I've marched into Hong Kong, which the international community said it was extremely important to them, with no cost. I've militarized the South China Sea with no cost. I'm watching my good friend Putin and what he may get away with just by threatening an invasion to split, to do great damage to Europe, which is still, by the way, a far more important trade market than Asia is, unless you include China, obviously. And I would say, there's all kinds of possibilities that I have to isolate Taiwan, batter their political will, and freak out the United States so much that they force Taiwan to accept demands. And then I'm happy if I'm Xi Jinping, if Taiwan is forced to say, and the United States forces to put it in the position to say that it accepts all the political demands that include some new version of one country, two systems. And he talks about this all the time, Xi Jinping. He talks about how that Taiwan can keep its own system. I mean, nobody believes him, but he's putting political demands out there all the time that we're not responding to. So while I think the invasion threat is obviously a serious one, obviously we have to take it seriously, I think that Xi Jinping still has a lot of possibilities, short of invasion, to get the political decision on Taiwan that he wants, which is to come to some agreement that would, quote, avoid separatism.
Thanks, Dan. Oriana, you're next.
Thank you. And thank you all for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to discuss Bridges' book. I was particularly excited when it came out because I probably wasted years of my life. Bridge probably was much more effective in the DoD than I was. Wasted so much time trying to convince the bureaucracy that deterrence by punishment was not the way that we needed to go with China. So it's very ingrained in U.S. thinking, this idea that if we can impose costs on our adversaries, that this will be enough to deter them. So you can hear my dog now barking. You can see her watercolor there in the background. Tava. She's protecting us in our dangerous neighborhood here in Stanford, California. This idea that if we impose those costs on China, then they'll be like, oh, well, this is very costly. I don't want to do this anymore. Now, the first aspect of this is what Dan mentioned, is I feel like we have this idea of costs that in reality has never existed. I argue that if the world did respond very strongly to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, let's just say U.S. allies and partners, we all cut off all trade with China. We all cut off diplomatic ties with China. I think that would be a cost that would be too high, that, China, short of Taiwan declaring independence, I think China would want to kick that can down the road. But as Dan alluded to, there's nothing about how countries have reacted to China to date to suggest that they're going to have that strong of a response. Now, to me, there have been some useful and maybe more optimistic data points with like AUKUS, with Australia being willing to put its security before economic ties, with Japanese leaders making statements about support of Taiwan. But these are just, one or two data points that can't really go against countries' behavior over the past 25 years. And it's not even countries' behavior. A lot of countries have signed explicit strategic partnerships with China in which they've agreed that their economic relationship is more important than any political issues, including Taiwan. So, in my mind, the United States got used to this cost and position type of strategies because our adversaries were so much weaker than we were. It was this idea, if I just hurt them, then they'll stop. And I firmly believe, at least in terms of operationally, if you told Xi Jinping today, you can have Taiwan, but you'll lose your Navy, he'd be like, I'll build another Navy. Like, the benefits are just so high in some cases to using force that it's really hard for the United States to come up with costs that are high enough. And also just on the operational side, one of the biggest issues with this is, what Bridge was alluding to when he mentioned kind of the credibility Of course, we can think of theoretically threats in which the costs would be too high of certain activities, but they're incredible, right? So operationally, there's a lot of things that China can do to basically, gain such an advantage in a war that they would win that we cannot deter. Or at least, let me just say, I have not been smart enough to come up with some sort of cost imposition way of deterring. So for example, I've done a lot of work with like the Space Force and US space assets. We rely on space assets to fight wars. There's no way to defend them. Like as many times as you want to like have some extra fuel on your satellites to move them a little one way, move them a little other way. Like in the end, there's definitely a benefit for the offense here. And, if China messes with our space assets, we can't fight a war. So what are we going to say? Like, and nobody dies, right? Like they don't even have to blow things up. They don't even have to mess with our space assets in ways that they're ruined. They could just be like temporarily offline through cyber, even some blinding or dazzling. So if we threaten like nuclear use in response to that, of course, China doesn't want nuclear detonation on their soil, but that is completely incredible. Like the United States would not do that in response to that level of action. So there's so many problems with cost imposition that it's really useful that Bridge took it upon himself to write a whole book about strategies of denial and why this is really the way to go. I firmly believe the thing that imposes the most caution on Xi Jinping is the fear of failure. Not how much it would cost, but this idea that he would not succeed. And so often in signaling to China, I think that's what we signal to them, like no matter how resolved you are, we will not let you make it across the strait, it'll be like one of those cartoons in which we have, our hand on your forehead and you're trying to get to, you just can't do it. Right. And there's a lot of ideas behind this that Bridge has also written very eloquently about, missiles in the second island chain, what have you, that they just cannot do it. And so when I read Bridges' book, I had this in mind, that this was a really useful way of looking at, what can we do to really have an effective, credible deterrent? And for the most part, how can we convince other countries to cooperate and interact with the United States along this sort of path? So I do think, Bridge identifies two approaches in terms of Beijing's strategy. Beijing uses punishment a lot because it does work for them in a coercive way. And they also use brute force. It's a little bit of both. But when it comes to Taiwan, I do think there is a limit to what they can achieve through coercion alone. This might be my bias with but I don't think the people of Taiwan are going to be giving up their freedom in the face of coercion. I really do think you need Chinese boots on the ground in this sort of fait accompli way. And that's why denial becomes, so very important. One of the things that I want to sort of posit, and I wonder, just because I'm interested in what Bridge and Dan and Colin would think about this, I've been doing a lot of thinking about, I consider it a third way, but maybe it's not a third way. Maybe it fits with costs. Maybe it fits with denial. But there's been a lot of discussion. I've done a lot of work on deterrence through resilience. So this idea, and I think it's somewhat underappreciated or underutilized, that it's not about the ability really to defend, but it's about reducing the operational benefits of a Chinese use of force. So what we basically want to show China is that they think, oh, we attack your satellites, you can't fight a war. We attack your bases, you can't fight a war. That the most viable strategies to enhancing our defense in some domains and in some cases where defense is very difficult, I agree with Bridge that we want to improve defense, but in some cases it's very difficult, would be instead to have the ability to signal that the benefits of that action are not as great as China believes, right? You attack our satellites, it's not going to impact our ability to mobilize and deploy forces and sustain, firepower over vast distances. This could be because the United States gets better at developing viable alternatives. Maybe we have redundancy, especially in space. There's a lot of discussion of having just additional satellite constellations, or maybe we have improved defenses. It could be, that we can more quickly launch satellites into orbit than China thought. Maybe we've signed agreements with other countries that we can easily substitute and use their assets when our assets are offline. But the idea here is to convince China that their attempts at brute force and also coercion would be ineffective. And I think in particular for when we're trying to build coalitions, one of the things that comes up a lot is, can we help Taiwan defend itself? Can we help the Philippines defend itself? I always think these are useful, obviously, like let's do everything we can, but there is no scenario in which these countries can defend themselves without the United States. Like none. Like if we're talking about conditions under which, there are many situations in which the United States can't defeat China, like, Taiwan doesn't really have a hope. Like maybe we don't say it out loud, but all we can hope for is they can delay as long as possible to let the United States come to their aid. But I think there are some things that smaller, medium power countries can do to work with the United States to enhance deterrence. And I think a lot of those fall within this resiliency category, because China's grand strategy has largely been to prevent a countervailing coalition from forming against them. And they threaten costs on these smaller countries to keep them from going against China's interests. I mean, China's first response to any mini-lateral grouping is to threaten costs if any sort of cooperation reaches a level that it can constrain China somehow. And so when we ask, like, can the Quad, for example, affect Chinese thinking, or cooperation between Japan, Taiwan, the United States? I mean, China's whole goal is to prevent these groupings from being able to reach that. And so if smaller countries are able to reduce the effectiveness of Chinese coercion, and this is not just military coercion, but obviously economic coercion, as well, by building the sort of aspects of resiliency, then this reduces the attractiveness of certain options for the PRC. I mean, in the end, if they attack the United States, this means war with the United States. They only want to do that if that attack has such operational benefits that it means that they have a higher likelihood of winning. And so I'd be curious, in this discussion, where the other participants think that kind of logic falls within this spectrum of denial and punishment. And if there are additional things that we can do to basically signal to China, not that we can protect ourselves per se, but that we can absorb and deflect those costs, that it won't hurt us to the degree that they think it will, because, again, redundancy, substitutability, or what have you. So I'll stop there. I mean, I've written a lot about Chinese views of Taiwan and how I think China is seriously considering initiating force across the strait. I do think at this point, really just developing and putting in the capabilities to stop them is what's necessary. Unfortunately, as Colin said in the introduction, even now, there's not this sense of urgency. Obviously, I'm here speaking only in my civilian capacity, and my views do not represent those of the U.S. government, the United States Air Force, or the United States Department of Defense. But I did just come off of 5 weeks of military duty, in which I was just looking at posture and plans, which I was just thinking to myself every day, like, are we still doing this? Do we still think this is going to work? Like, where are the new ideas? And I want more of those. And so I was very happy to see, Bridge putting pen to paper to put some of those into the discussion.
Great. Thanks, Oriana. So at this point, I'm just going to mention, I've got a number of questions for all of our panelists, but if AI would be willing to put back up on the screen the address for viewers to send questions, that would be helpful. It might take a minute. There you go. Please feel free to send questions, and we've already got a few. So let me start by asking Bridge, and then we'll go in the same order to Dan and Oriana. Kind of maybe a two-part question to start with. I thought those were good summaries of the basic issue, and could we hear, Bridge, just a few examples, maybe nitty-gritty, of what exactly the Biden administration, what the U.S. could be doing better militarily in terms of our defense posture in the region, whether it's in relation to Taiwan or in the Indo-Pacific generally, in order to actually deter China. And then there has been a criticism, I'm sure you're aware, Bridge, that's out there, which is, if we take a kind of hardline, quote unquote, posture in relation to China, that's going to unintentionally provoke conflict, and we don't want that. So if anything, we should try to be less provocative. And I think we need to ask, how do you respond to that kind of criticism?
Well, thanks, and great comments. I mean, I think Oriana actually, where she ended, and I really just fundamentally agree with her whole, approach that she laid out there. I think that way of kind of thinking about deterrence and specifically what we're trying to achieve and what standard we need to achieve and what works is what's necessary. And actually, this book, in some sense, was motivated by my frustrations dealing often, well, with civilians and military professionals in the Pentagon, and this fuzziness about our thinking and this kind of slapdash element with cost imposition and just what do we really need to do, and just trying to really boil that down and, you know, give us something, a framework to work with. But I think, you know, exactly what she was saying, like, you know, Clint Highnote, you know, whom Oriana knows as well, like, he's basically saying, well, we're losing the war games, but we figured out how we need to, how we can do better, and we're not doing that. So whatever it is, and I'm not saying that Clint is, you know, didn't come down from the mountaintop, but like things like that, and we should be erring on the side of caution. So fund those things, fund what the Marines have come up with, fund what the Navy's come up with, fund what the Indo-PACOM has come up with, the PDI request, and, you know, Guam defense, you could go back and forth, but have some idea. And then, like, don't come out with a global posture review and say, we came up with a new process, we'll get to more fundamental changes, you know? I mean, maybe there's stuff going on behind the curtain. It's possible. Color me skeptical, but I would just think we would just be, you know, all hands on deck, you know, to make sure that we get and we don't have any margin on this problem, because I think Oriana is exactly right, which is if it gets into a cost imposition issue or brinksmanship issue, that's not good for us. But, you know, people say, oh, the Chinese care a lot more about Taiwan than we do. Well, that's been true since 1949, but they haven't done anything because they knew they would lose, right? So let's keep them in that situation and not take any risk about it. Like, let's double down. And if, you know, the Marines are the heroes here right now because they're, and you know, General Brown, the Air Force seems to be trying to do a similar thing. It's harder and a bigger service, but, you know, get rid of tanks, get rid of heavy artillery that's not necessary, and try to figure it out. That's what we should be seeing. And we should be seeing the leadership of the department making very clear that that's what's going to be rewarded. Instead, when I was at Reagan, I heard the Secretary of Defense say, don't overreact. Things are okay. You know, like as if it was like 15 years ago. I mean, it was, you know, I get that we don't want to panic in the sense that we don't want to look like we absolutely can't do anything. But that was a much more worrying than a panicked remark would be, because that suggests a sanguinity that is totally unjustified. And frankly, the Congress seems to be trying to rectify some of this. So that's good, but it's not, you know, the executive should really be the one driving it, because it's obviously the executive, right? That's the point. So that's what I should be seeing. And we should be seeing a much stronger signaling in Europe and the Middle East that we're going to be doing less, because that and force structure in the Army, these are the kinds of things you'd want to see. I know it's hard, but it's going to be a lot worse if we lose a war over Taiwan. I mean, let's just be honest for a second. If Oriana's right, and I fully agree with her, that they are seriously contemplating, and we are kind of getting into a knife's edge over the next few years, you don't want to be the president who was the one who oversaw what led up to that defeat. That would be the worst defeat in American history, basically, because we've never lost a great power war. We've lost counterinsurgency wars. We lost the war in Indochina, obviously in Afghanistan. Those were elective wars. We have never lost a direct war against a great power. And that would, I mean, if I were the Biden administration, I'd be like, I don't want that on me. You know, I don't want to be the one who lost China. Remember how that went in the 50s. You know, so that's the kind of the level. So I don't have a point answer. And in fact, I wrote the book, and I think Oriana will appreciate this. I didn't want to pick winners and losers over some of the specifics that get people in the military and the defense community really tied around the axle, because I don't know enough. I know more than a lot of people, but I'm not the world's expert. Others are. But I wanted to set a framework for the debate so people are debating about the right kinds of things. And that's where we should be. And that's not where we are. On the second point, are we risking conflict? Yes. But the alternative is doing nothing, and then we'll either lose or we'll fork Asia. Or I don't mean to be rude to you, Colin, but this argument, I mean, some people give it, you know, oh, like they could preempt us or something, which is kind of a circular argument because it proves that they're dangerous. But, you know, look, my view, and it's maybe different from some others, is I actually do think we could get to a situation where we could have a kind of a détente or what have you with the Chinese, but we have to go through a period of tension and confrontation to get there, because we've been so screwed up over the last generation, as Dan has written about for so long, you know, that we followed, peaceful rise, and we bought into this, and we got concentrated on other things. And there's been an arms race. We just haven't been participating in it. I mean, final thought on this point, you know, I get I get criticized from two sides on this. One is we're toast, the Lyle Goldstein argument, which is like, there's no hope, we're toast. And then the other argument is, you know, you take money from the war profiteers and you're exaggerating the threat. I'll tell you, I take the Lyle Goldstein criticism much more seriously. Like, I just think the latter one is ludicrous. I mean, if you look, it's the huge military buildup. It's a hugely powerful country. The former worries me. I think we can avert it, but it's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean, let me bring this back to what I was saying before. This is at heart a political competition with a military piece to it. So the CCP does not need to invade and occupy Taiwan. It just doesn't. It may have to, should nothing else, should every other avenue be cut off. But the CCP needs a regime in Taiwan that accepts its political demands. And we have not even seen the beginnings of what a coercion campaign could look like. The battering, the ability of China to create a crisis, a real crisis that actually forces the president of the United States, who, by the way, we don't know a single president who's ever served who would order the defense of Taiwan. We don't have a political commitment. A lot of this talk is sort of in the policy wonk community. And what scares me a lot is that one day somebody's going to bring a bunch of options about how to deny an invasion, which means sinking a lot of Chinese ships, which means hitting a lot of Chinese targets on China. And the president of the United States is going to look at it. And I've been in, pretty close to these situations in the past and say, no one's going to order that. Again, so what I obviously don't want that outcome, but we need some reality here, right? So first and foremost, we need to respond politically and diplomatically to Chinese challenges, including telling them very clearly that we don't accept their version of the one China policy, the way they're defining it. That's not our version of it. We should, if we want to build a coalition, we need diplomatically to go around to all the key countries in the world saying they are in breach of their obligations. And we could find ourselves in a situation where we're prepared for an invasion threat, and Taiwan is doing great damage. China's doing great damage to the Taiwan political system. Look, I know the argument. Like, I'm the first one who made it, right? I think, or a group of us who made it after the DPP was started winning and winning and winning. The Taiwanese generationally have moved far away from any association with China. They don't want it anymore. But this wholly depends on our support. I mean, it's sort of like you take the sort of inverse of Bridges' point on Cuba. There are a lot of countries who want independence and don't want to be part of other countries. Then they're forced into it. So China still sees that politically, diplomatically, militarily, they could create a perception, and maybe even more than a perception, that the United States will not back Taiwan, and Taiwan will have no choice but to give in to their political demands, and then they'll move on to other countries. So I think, again, I think obviously I am with Bridge on the need for being able to defend against the most a very probable scenario. And I agree. I mean, I was at Pentagon in 2002 warning about the China military power threat and how we're not taking it seriously at all. I agree with all of that. It's just simply not enough. And if you don't have a strategy for political resilience in Taiwan, for political shoring up of the will, that's not maximized or optimized necessarily towards your operational goals, which, by the way, was always the case in our allied relations in the Cold War and at other times, that sometimes you optimize your military strategy to shore up the political will of a frontline state, then we could find ourselves in a situation where we're put under enormous threat and pressure, and we find ourselves in a situation where, under that kind of crisis that the Chinese are engendering, and we don't want to go to war, we put pressure on Taiwan to give in to political demands, and that's all China needs. That's what they talk about. That's what they've laid out. That's how they operated on Hong Kong. They need a government in Taiwan that will say, even if they don't mean it, that will say and make good on China's demands and its vision for Taiwan, which is essentially one country, two systems. Finally, so I'd say one big response you need, and by the way, so much of China's work on Taiwan is not military. So much of their time and effort is in UN organizations, is trying to put the squeeze on Taiwan diplomatically. They know how that affects Taiwan, and so much of Taiwan's pushback is to reverse the sense of isolation, because Taiwan knows what isolation means for its populace and its leadership's will to fight. So we need a counter subversion, counter coercion strategy. We need to take the invasion threat seriously, but it leaves way too much room. It's kind of like giving way too much responsibility to chief warfighters, when responsibility for a comprehensive Taiwan policy, a counter coercion, counter subversion policy, should be in the hands of policy leaders and political leaders.
So much to follow up on. And I see there's a couple of questions I can also touch upon that have been put in the chat. So the first one about unintentionally provoking conflict. I mean, this is one that comes up all the time. So Graham Allison asked me to come out to Harvard to do like a book talk when he first came out with the Thucydides trap book. And he had received like a lot of flack from other academics about, this is too aggressive. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy. But he said that I gave a very unique critique in which I recoded all the cases. So he has all these cases of rising powers and great powers. And his main question is, does this lead to war? And he has this argument, because of great power hubris or whatever, that we fight wars we don't need to fight. I looked at all those wars and I was like, those are wars that needed to be fought. Does anyone look at World War II and they're like, oh man, like that's a war we didn't need to fight? I mean, I think it's very easy to avoid war. You give the other side everything they want, but there are some cases in which that is not an option. So the first thing I looked at is that, and I was like, I don't see these as mistakes. I see these as necessary conflicts. And the second thing that I found even more interesting than how many times war happened was how many times the rising power was able to unseat the great power, either through war or peacefully. And it was over 75% of the time. And so as an American strategist, I also look at that and I say, my job isn't to avoid war, right? Like, ideally, the United States can achieve what it wants to achieve without fighting a war against China. But I think in certain circumstances, that war is worth fighting. The Chinese are not going to be pushed into a war that they don't think is beneficial to them and that they can't win. So I always get this like, oh, but what if like we do some, we're doing more maneuvers around Taiwan, or what if like, we make these statements in the South China Sea? There's a reason they're not pushing back in the South China Sea as much as Taiwan. And that's because they are, at this point, they're incapable of projecting power across the South China Sea. So they know if they, there's no situation under which an accident or even, US pushing back is going to cause them to fight a war with us there, because they would lose. Okay, so this is, will it provoke? Yes, it can lead to some tensions. The bottom line is the CCP asks itself, like, is the United States going to completely concede to all of our demands short of war? And if the answer to that is no, then they think that probably a war is going to be likely. So we can't sort of say, okay, yes, it's overly provocative because we're doing these FON-ops. That's going to cause a war. I mean, what's going to cause a war is that we have conflicting interests, and the United States is unwilling to give up what is very important to us in terms of our values, security, and prosperity. And until we decide we're willing to give all that stuff up, there's always the likelihood of conflict, and it's not going to be sort of unintentionally provoked. Someone asked this question of like, what will it take for the DoD to get its mind together? Like, I don't know. I will tell you that like a couple years ago, I had a colonel call me who had never met me before, but said, me and a bunch of colonels were looking at what you were doing at the Pentagon, and we all decided that we don't like you. And I was like, maybe it's a feminine thing. Like, I'm like, but I'm trying not to be too confrontational. I'll try to be nice. I was like, what do you mean? So I go to my husband and I was like, this is so upsetting. Like, these people don't like me. And this was a revelation a couple of years ago. He said to me, are you kidding? Yeah, most people do not like you. And I was like, what? Like, what do you mean most people don't like me? He was like, let me ask you this. If I tell you that this thing is not possible, what is your response? My response is, well, of course it's possible. Like, let's figure out a way to make it work. I actually was almost late to this call because I had an 06 yelling at me on the phone about something that I think is perfectly possible, that the Air Force could shift strategies if it wanted. But, I'm the difficult person. I'm difficult because I'm so sick of people being like, oh, well, we can't do that. We can't. We're the most powerful country that's ever existed. Like, Bridge referred to the Global Posture Review. Now, partially, maybe it was because of COVID and my move. I have small kids. I wasn't paying attention. So I recently learned that the Global Posture Review was not a review of global posture. I was in a meeting and I was like, well, obviously, what the smart thing to do would be we review the threats and the challenges, and then we decide what would be the ideal posture to have given what we need to achieve. And then we come up with policies and strategies to achieve that posture. That is not what we did. And I just learned this and I was shocked that basically we were like, okay, it's too much to try to do anything new. So let's just do maybe a little bit more in the same places we've always done it. And I was like, that's not going to cut it. So I don't know, does it take an aircraft carrier at the bottom of the sea? I don't know what it takes. No one seems to understand this sense of urgency of either we're going to be fighting a major war in which more people die in the first couple of days than Afghanistan and Iraq put together, or we're basically going to completely lose our ability to protect U.S. security and interests if we concede to China. And no one seems to be they're too busy yelling at me about small changes I want to make to think outside of the box. And let me just say this, someone asked about China and Russia and what can we do to deter both? We cannot do both. We cannot do it. I just had a conversation with the administration. I get that what's happening in Ukraine is a problem, but if we do this, well, I've got to fight here, I've got to fight there to show resolve and credibility, we do not have the resources. And this book I'm working on right now, one of the main things that China has learned is how much money the United States wastes on foreign military interventions. We've done 105 of them since 1947. We have over 120 military bases around the world. We spend hundreds of billions of dollars maintaining this. China has no military forces abroad besides 32 peacekeepers that they have through the United Nations, and yet they're able to protect their interests. We have to make strategic decisions. Afghanistan cost 10 Belt and Road initiatives. We have to take strategic risks. And so if you ask me what's more important, Taiwan or Ukraine, I say Taiwan. What is more important, Asia or the future of Europe? I say Asia. And I will also say that our NATO allies are much better positioned to deal with Russia than our European allies to deal with Russia than our Asian allies are to deal with China. So we have to make some of those tough decisions. And maybe some of my sort of blatant views on that can be added to the reasons why nobody likes me at the Department of Defense. But, I'm going to be one of the first ones to deploy. I have to believe that this is important. I have to believe I did everything I could, and I have to be pushy about it in order to try to achieve what I think we need to achieve.
Can I jump in here, Colin? Because Oriana's just hit it so well, and there's one person who agrees with you no longer in the Department of Defense, and that's me. And to your point about Graham's stuff, some of those wars should have been fought, but also a lot of those wars probably could have been avoided if we had done the kinds of things beforehand that we could have done and we didn't, and we paid for it later. So there are chances of inadvertent war, maybe World War I in part, but World War II clearly, if we had had a better situation. And I think I could say it at AEI. I've supported one war in my adult lifetime, which was the original narrow mission in Afghanistan. I don't like foreign military interventions. But obviously, if we'd taken a different position in the interwar years, it could have gone better, and we never would have fought a war at all. And even in World War I, well, what if the British had actually been on the continent and the Germans had had a different assessment? Maybe the war wouldn't have happened because the Germans would have decided, like the Chinese, this isn't going to go well. And by the way, the Cold War is the counterexample. People say, the Cold War was so many risks. And, well, yeah. Yes, although the alternative, if the U.S. hadn't been willing to run those risks and have that military posture, would have been the Soviet Union dominating Europe, the world's critical theater. So this is what, your urgency is exactly right. What Oriana just said, that is what serious conversations right now need to be like. We can't fight two wars at the same time. And people who say we can chew gum at the same and walk and chew gum at the same time, not dealing with reality. We can't be. People are saying we can be balanced. Not true. And also, there's this assumption, and it relates to that cost imposition point you're making, Oriana, where like American strategists are more clever than Russian or Chinese strategists, which I find hard to believe. But at a minimum, it should be a wash, right? We should if we don't have enough resources, we should assume that we have to make the choices. And if you're not grappling with those choices, that's not a real strategy. And I mean, Dan's points about the political stuff, I don't disagree with a lot of that stuff, but we got to get the military piece right. That's the foundational thing. As Chairman Mao said it, power comes out of the barrel of the gun. And I think Oriana's exactly right. like, I would rather leave it all in the field. And if I were in government right now, I would rather leave it all on the field, because there could be a war tomorrow. It could be in a year. It could be in 2 years and 3 years. Now is when you have the chance. And if you're not doing what you could, people are going to look back. If for reasons only of self-preservation, I don't know. Like, try and don't be subtle. Don't do integrated deterrence. Kill the enemy before they can achieve their goals, and let there be no doubt about it. Don't be integrated. Don't be subtle or nuanced or academic about it. Just prepare to win to a reasonable degree. And that's in a sense why I wrote this book, is like I would go around the Pentagon with my hair on fire, and I get these eye rolls and, oh, here's Colby talking about China and Taiwan again or whatever. And it's like, well, that's what I think our nation deserves. And I don't know what these other people, these putative sophisticates or whatever, these balanced people are going to do, because that's the way you get to the Graham Allison outcome. So, amen, sister. And by the way, you're an airwoman, I guess. If you're not taking flak, you're not over the target. I was told at one point that down at Special Forces Command, there was like a picture of me with a knife in somebody's desk, which I was like, I got JSOC going to come after me at nighttime or something like that. So we're in it together, Oriana, on that one.
Dan, you had a two-finger?
Yeah, it's just simply not realistic. I mean, that we're not, going to take the Russia threat seriously. I mean, that's like, to me, that's like I don't mean to be insulting to anyone. That's like a theoretical wonk war game. Like, President of the United States and the National Security Advisor and the pressures on Europe because of what we did in World War II, and because it's been such a successful alliance. Now, we can say that America is badly screwed up. We've gotten to this point where we are the richest, by far the richest country on earth. I mean, we dwarf China's national wealth, dwarf it. And we made a whole bunch of choices. I mean, everyone's right there. We've made a choice to not resource, a basic fundamental tenet of everybody who shaped the World War II defense order, which was we were not going to let a hegemon roll up through Europe anymore, and we weren't going to let that happen in Asia anymore. So yes, we made a series of choices as a nation to waste a lot of money, and the amount of money we quote wasted on wars that everybody after 9/11 thought were necessary. Everybody, I mean, everybody in power, is like drops in the bucket compared to how much money we waste now on so much else domestically. So, I agree with the premise that we have made a bunch of political choices in this nation, one of which is to become highly indebted and spend a lot of money on unproductive forces. And we're in a real problem. I don't deny that with respect to where we are on defending Taiwan and defending Russia and Ukraine, but it's just simply, from a political standpoint, not realistic to say that we aren't going to take, we're not going to be doing everything we can to stop Russia from causing mischief in Europe, which again is sort of the heart culturally and economically still of U.S. strategy. On the Taiwan issue, it's been very important to me. It's been very important to it's Oriana and Bridge. If we were really serious about it in the way that we're talking about, that it is more important than the Ukraine, we'd have a political commitment to defend it in a treaty. We wouldn't be playing these. Now we're in the most dangerous situation possible, which is a lot of us think that it's the most important place to defend, but we have no processes besides some of the important operational ideas to defend it. So we have nobody's with us. I mean, Japan has made some. Japan has made some movements in that direction, but still, if you're going to compare defense budgets and posture and so forth between Japan and even nations in Europe, they're not going to come up well. And we have no way we don't operate with a Taiwan military. We don't know the Taiwan military. The Taiwan military doesn't have our war plans. We're going to get to know each other in this conflict. And again, I just want to inject some political reality. I mean, so again, if it is actually true that it is the most important place to defend, and I don't deny it, it might be. I'd have to calculate if we're really, going to make a choice between defending Europe and defending Taiwan. Then we would be doing things in a much more serious fashion, including having an actual political commitment. We don't even recognize it as a country. I can go back to that. We don't even let Taiwanese into the State Department.
Thanks, Dan. We have 5 minutes left, and as I suspected, time is flying. So I have really one more question for all three of you. I'll start with Bridge. Bridge, one of the things that struck me about your book was that most books with the word strategy in them don't actually have a strategy, and they also don't have an end game. And it seems to me, as whether you agree or disagree with a given strategy, you need to specify the end game. What's the end game? I mean, you can imagine the abstract a variety of possible end games when it comes to U.S.-Chinese competition. And here it gets interesting, because even on this panel, I know we have some variety of opinion on the significance of the Communist Party to China's foreign policy. The possibility of Chinese decline actually in the coming years. In your view, and then I'll ask the others to respond, what is the end game to Sino-American competition? How does it eventually end? And I'll just tack on, I think a relevant question from the chat, which is there a kind of Reagan-style rollback option here, or how do you view this? Thanks.
Sure. Well, first, to Dan's point, I disagree, Dan. I mean, look, like we did it with China, right? I mean, in living memory, the United States did an opening to China. By the way, the British, before World War I, settled like 4 major serious rivalries with the United States, Japan, Russia, and France in order to focus on the primary threat. These things are possible. We made it common cause with the Soviet Union during the Second World War, even though we loathed them before and after. So, it's just a matter of recognizing the strategic threat, and that's what the challenge is here. This is what is to go up against this inertia. And I would say to you, Dan, don't be shy about Asia's primacy. Europe it's going to be 10% of global GDP in 20 years, according to the EU Zone Supremo. Asia is the critical theater. Europe but also to Oriana's point, they way outweigh Russia in latent military power, certainly in economic capability. So they can pull their own weight, which was the idea of NATO in the first place anyway. It was not going to be a permanent U.S. constabulary kind of model. What's the end goal? And I agree with you, Colin. Like, what's a strategy? Strategy's got to deal with scarcity. So it gives it has a logic for how you deal with problems. The deterrence by denial concept, that's the idea, and that creates a certain demand signal in which you have to situate that within the overall scarcity. The end goal, to me, strategy is never final. I think it's attributed to Churchill or Clausewitz, because probably nobody knows who said it. But basically, there's no end goal in the full sense. But my goal is an adaptive balance of power that sufficiently protects our interests and those of us with us. And particular parties in that might switch teams or what have you. But basically, we and the Chinese would each have a kind of a coalition. We'd be able to trade across it to some degree, although less than maybe in the past. But that would be the end goal. And that would, once we have that firm position, we will be in a position of strength to actually have more negotiation with the Chinese. To the rollback question that I saw in some sense, actually rollback, it worked in the context of the USSR, but we still have a Russia problem, right? So I don't think rollback is, or really, regime change in this context. I don't think it would actually solve our problem. I think a Chinese even a non-communist Chinese government would probably pose very serious problems to us because of its power and because of its structural incentives towards regional hegemony. And you could point to nationalism, whatever your preferred factor. So I think that's, we have to accept that China, to me, there's this idea that balance of power, kind of realpolitik thinking, is incompatible with American political thought. I actually think the reverse is true. Bill Barr said a couple of years ago, he said the core of the American political model is not the Bill of Rights, it's actually the separation of powers, that nobody can be entrusted with too much power. And that's our domestic logic, but by the same token, we have to have a skeptical, distrustful attitude towards China as a kind of a strategic matter, no matter what it's like. If they turn into democracy, I wouldn't want to fork Asia over them. And when you talk to their Asian neighbors, they feel the same way. They don't. That's not the critical issue for them.
Dan.
Yeah. Just real quick, on economic numbers, most of the so China is an important trading partner. EU and Canada and Mexico are the other top trading partners. And there's some hopes that Vietnam and Indonesia and the Philippines will one day be important trading partners, but we don't do trade deals anymore, which was the way we used to do asymmetric trade deals, and that's how China, Taiwan, and others actually managed to grow fast and reform their economies. So it's not. There's projections, but it's not clear that, and I certainly have devoted my life to Asia. I hope some of those projections come true, but it's not a done deal. It will be. Look, to your point about defense, I mean, let me sort of put aside some of these concerns I have about the political warfare strategy in China. Defense in Asia, the defense of a free and open order that we both agreed to, that President Trump and Prime Minister Abe agreed to, is absolutely fundamental to any order building in Asia, and so let me completely agree on that point. I mean, you have to get the defense piece of it right. My concerns are you can get the defense piece of it right on Taiwan and still lose. But to Colin, look, there's some first order questions for U.S. strategy against the Chinese Communist Party, and it is very idiosyncratic to the Chinese Communist Party. I don't know what would come next. If something came next, maybe it would be worse. But historically, we've been on China's side. When during World War II and the KMT and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of historical evidence that says that China, that the United States and China are not natural enemies and actually have been more naturally partnered than with any other country in Asia throughout U.S. history. So this has been a particular CCP problem. The CCP has a particular strategy. The CCP has 90 million people. It's a big country, and people have to remember that. It's not just it is its own big country with its own preferences, its own desires, its own strategy, its own so you have to really take on the CCP and what it thinks, but there's some first order questions and that we just haven't answered in the nation. For example, and this is bigger, what kind of economic relationship do we want with someone who we might fight a major war against? Right now, our answer seems to be a very good one that in fact keeps enriching them, right? So to me, it's that do we want the CCP to succeed? Are there things that we can do in the political warfare realm that actually, when you talk about cost imposition, I'm not talking about space and satellites. I'm talking about the kind of deterrence Reagan administration actually thought about. What do the leaders of the CCP care about, and how can you threaten those things so that they don't do things that you don't want them to do, right? To me, that's strategy at a higher level. Maybe nothing. Maybe the answer is nothing, right? But you have to explore that, and I would argue we haven't even begun to explore it. It's too controversial to even talk about. So those two things, first order questions of U.S. strategy. What kind of economic relationship do you want? Do you want to keep enriching China? And number two, is there anything you can do to the set of leaders who are avowedly trying to undermine you and displace you as the great power and harm you economically? Is there anything you can do to hold what they care at risk? Or do you have to go, and again, I don't mean to simplify anybody's very complex arguments, or does this have to end up in a war of denial over Taiwan?
Yeah, I know we're out of time, so I'm just gonna give a very brief answer to kind of like, what does this look like? We're gonna be doing this competition thing with China forever, at least for my whole lifetime. And what I want to see is that in capitals around the world, countries ask first when they make decisions, what will the United States think about this? And then they ask second, what will China think about this? We've talked mainly about military issues, but everything we've said about the lack of sense of urgency, creative thinking, applies to all aspects of U.S. power. Dan alluded to the fact that we don't do free trade agreements anymore. China has more free trade agreements than the United States does. I'm all about the Biden administration leading with diplomacy. I have a list of ideas of where they can be more proactive in terms of setting up new international institutions to constrain China in cyber and space, but there's no appetite for any of this, new types of relationships, new approaches to North Korea. So whether it is and how the United States does development assistance, how the United States interacts with problematic countries. Like, why do we cut off relations with countries that are engaging in human rights abuses? Why don't we double the size of our embassy? I don't know, because that's the way we've always done things. I think that can be said across issue areas, those of which I'm an expert at and those in which I'm not. And that's why I'm trying to write a whole book right now about how China competes and what the United States can do. But in general, we just have to ask, just throw out all the conventional wisdoms and say, with a clean slate, is there a better way to do this? And then Dan's right. There's a lot of political issues. I have no patience for politics. I just want to win. And so then we have to figure out how to get through the slog of the bureaucracies and the politics, but let's try to figure out what the best policies are first. And thank you for letting me be a part of this discussion, and congratulations to Bridge for writing a book that contributes to that goal.
Thanks, Oriana. Okay, well, I want to thank all our panelists for a really stimulating discussion. And just as I suspected, this went by very quickly. Bridge, congratulations again on your book and the big impact it's had. Great work. And thank you to the audience from AAI. And with that, we will say goodbye.
Thank you.